Labour costs typically make up anywhere between 20% to 40% of the value of a construction project. And in this video, I'm going to walk you through step by step how you can accurately calculate the labour costs for your project. So this video is for any construction business owners or construction managers who need to learn how to accurately estimate these costs. In addition, I'll put a link in the video description to a spreadsheet that you can download for free that shows you how to basically calculate these costs more accurately so you can prepare more accurate estimates and tenders for your projects. This video is targeted at anybody in the construction sector who needs to know how to accurately estimate project costs from first principles. So it's for construction project managers, construction business owners, project engineers, and also people working in estimating or a pre-contract role, although I'd hope that you'd already know this stuff pretty well if you're working in a job like that. Before we get stuck into the process of how we calculate labour costs, I just want to go through a couple of the reasons why estimating labour costs on construction projects is particularly difficult. The first one is project scopes are complicated. Construction projects involve a variety of different trades. Some of them we self-perform, some of them we subcontract. And accurately estimating the costs of all these different tasks is challenging. You can come across new tasks that you've never managed before, that you might not have accurate estimating data or cost tracking data, and that you might not be able to find production rates or standard production rates available to you. The other reason is designs are different from project to project. The sequence, staging, methodology we use to construct one design might be completely different on another project, and we need to factor all of this into our labour rate build-up, as well as different products or systems. So for example, if you're working on a solar farm, there's multiple different vendors you could use for the tracker system. All of them are going to be slightly different in terms of how you assemble it and what the resulting labour costs of assembling the tracker system is going to be. So we've got to factor all of that into our labour cost build-up. We've also got varying site conditions. Access for a particular task might be difficult. For example, we could be trenching through rock as opposed to trenching through good ground conditions, and we'll be faced with completely different production rates. The final one is that, unfortunately, construction is a somewhat commoditized industry, which basically means the lowest cost bidder is likely going to be the one that wins the tender. So we're operating already in a market that rewards people for underquoting jobs. That means if you've underestimated your labor costs, you're actually more likely to win the tender. So we're going to factor all of this in and consider it when we go through this process of estimating labour costs. Just quickly, my name's Tim and I run an outsourced construction services agency tailored at small to medium-sized construction companies that want help outsourcing and streamlining some of these processes. And I'll put a link in the description of the video to our website where we've also got a bunch of free training programs and courses and resources that hopefully you can use and find valuable. Okay. So what are construction labour costs? Well, construction labour costs form a portion of the direct costs for the projects. The direct costs are the costs to physically do the construction work. So direct costs are things like pouring concrete, standing structural steel, trenching, laying conduits, these sort of activities that need to be completed to complete the project. The labour costs are one of the four components of the project direct costs. So for our direct costs, we've got our labour, we've got our plant, we've got our materials, and we've also got our subcontract costs. The labour costs are the cost of the physical labour, so the people we employ to perform these tasks. Some examples of labour costs could be electricians, machine operators, labourers, traffic management personnel, basically anybody we directly employ for works we self-perform. Remember, we've got two options to deliver any package of works. We can self-perform it, or we can subcontract it out to another company. Labour costs form a portion of any of the works we self-perform. Working out our labour costs is basically a sub-process of calculating the direct costs of the project. However, there's some specifics with how we work out our labour costs that I haven't touched on in previous videos where I've spoken about the estimating process. The number one thing I see people getting confused with, which I'll touch on later, when talking about labour costs, is they look at the salary they pay someone as a way of working out the cost of the labour for that person. And as we're going to see, that's incorrect, and that if you're using that method, you're underestimating the true cost of the labor. The process we're going to go through when we work out labor costs is we're going to basically want to calculate an hourly rate of what it costs someone to do a task. We want to determine a productivity factor, so how quickly that person can complete the task. We want to then calculate the man hours for each of these tasks, then determine total man hours for the task, then also work out our labor overheads. The first thing we're going to work out is we're going to work out our labor cost rate. As I was saying before, this is different to what somebody is paid. This is different to their salary. It's the cost we incur to employ someone. So we have to factor in things like their salary, obviously, which is going to be the biggest part of it, but we're also going to think about things like on-costing. So annual leave, if we're employing someone under a full-time contract, we've got to pay them 2 to 4 weeks a year of annual leave. We've got to allow for non-productive time. We've got to allow for certain insurances. All this stuff has to be built into their labor rate, which we then allocate to a task. If we're using someone's salary to work this out, then we're fundamentally underestimating the true total costs of employing that person. The first portion of the labor cost rate that we're going to look at, and the biggest part and the part we're all aware of, is somebody's salary. We all know what a salary is, but what we have to be mindful for is a salary doesn't just consist of someone's base wages. We have to factor in things like overtime. We have to factor in allowances, any special conditions, superannuation, leave entitlements, penalty rates, shift loading, all these sorts of things. The way we do that, in Australia, when we employ someone, we'll have an enterprise bargaining agreement. We have to be mindful of what the specific conditions of the EBA are. In some circumstances, for example, you have to pay people a travel allowance. For example, if you're working on a project that's further than 70 kilometers from the center of the CBD, you might have to pay somebody an additional travel allowance of $50 a day. It really depends on the specific conditions in the EBA. So when we're allowing for someone's salary, we have to be very, very mindful of all these other conditions. And particularly, we have to be mindful of things like overtime, shift loading. So for example, if we have to do works at night, all these things have to be factored into the rate we build up for somebody's salary. The next thing we have to factor in is on-costing. So on-costing is basically where we mark up someone's salary or what they get paid to cover all the additional costs we have to cover as an employer. So for example, in Australia, like a lot of other countries, employers have to make contributions to employees' superannuation. So we'd have to allow for that in our build-up. We'd have to allow for workers' compensation insurance, payroll tax, and also leave entitlements. If we have to pay someone 4 weeks annual leave a year, plus 2 weeks public holidays, plus sick leave, all these things build up. So if we're paying someone $50,000 a year, but of those 52 weeks in a year, 8 weeks of the year they're on holidays, the hourly rate we allocate to a task has to factor in all this additional time they're getting paid for, but that they're not doing productive work. We use a really simple Excel calculator that I've put a link to in the description of the video, which basically walks you through how to build up this accurate hourly cost rate. So we put in the base rate, so the hourly rate someone's employed at, the overtime rate, any additional allowances you have to pay them. So if you have to pay them a travel allowance, if you have to pay them a daily allowance, if you have to pay them a tool allowance, things like this, you can enter it all in. You can then put in the number of hours you're planning on working per week. So if you've got a project with a compressed schedule, you'll probably plan to do a lot of overtime. But if it's a more casual project where you don't have the same push to make the schedule, you might choose to do no overtime. And then any on-costing amounts, so what percentage markup you put on for annual leave, public holidays, sick leave, these sorts of things, and basically builds up an accurate hourly cost rate. And the last portion of this is the productivity factor. Someone's at work for 10 hours a day. We know they're not actually working 10 hours a day. You've got to have lunch, you've got to go to the bathroom, you've got to have pre-start in the morning. Basically, we have to work out a number of non-productive hours per day, factor this all in, and then we calculate an actual cost rate. So what is the cost per hour we should be allocating to the task to accurately calculate the costs? This hourly rate is the hourly rate we have to apply to the task to accurately calculate the true cost of employing someone. So even if we pay someone $40 an hour, if their salary says they get paid $40 an hour, the true cost rate we have to allocate to the task, depending on how much overtime we do, depending on what sort of additional allowances they have, might be $90 an hour. It really, really depends on the specific conditions under which somebody's employed, the amount of overtime you're doing, and all these other factors that the spreadsheet will help you walk through. And basically, the labor cost is then going to be this hourly rate that we've calculated multiplied by the man hours for the project. This leads us into the second part of this exercise, where now we know the cost per hour of employing someone, we have to work out the total number of hours we're going to need. So the total number of labor hours we're going to need for the project. Basically, we're going to do this. We're going to go through each of the activities and we're going to work out how many man hours to allocate to each task. Now we have to think about these tasks in two separate categories. There's our schedule-driven tasks and there's our production-driven tasks. So a production-driven task is probably the easiest to understand. It's basically the number of hours we allocate to a task is the volume of work we have to do divided by the productivity. For example, if we have to install 100 meters squared of formwork and an individual can do 2 meters squared of formwork per hour, the total time we need to allocate to this is 100 meters squared divided by 2 meters squared per hour, so 50 man hours. Sorry, a volume of work divided by a rate that somebody's working out to calculate the man hours for the task. The other set of activities we have to be very mindful of are schedule-driven tasks. So a schedule-driven task is a one-off task that there's a setup time, a pack-up time, and it basically means we can't accurately estimate the time it's going to do that task using a production rate. What I mean by this is, say we have 1,000 electric cables to install. We've got to go set up a drum, pull in the cables, they're all in the same area, and a crew can just consistently work at this task and install 2,000 meters a shift, for example, over a significant period of time. Using that shift rate of 2,000 meters per shift is going to be a pretty accurate way of working out the total man hours. That's going to be very, very different to if we have one cable to install. We're still going to do the same amount of pack up and setup. We're still going to have to go through all the overheads for the task, but we're only going to be doing a single cable pull. If we use that same production rate of 2,000 meters a shift, then we're vastly underestimating the man hours required for that task. So that single cable pull would classify as a schedule-driven task. Now, typically schedule-driven tasks are things like concrete pours, where we're just going to pour a certain slab at once and there's a setup time and pack up time associated with it. And we can't use the same production factors and productivity factors to accurately work out the true man hours for the task. So that's why when we're looking at all these different activities, we have to be mindful of the methodology behind which we're going to complete the project. When we're talking about production-driven tasks, we need to come up with a productivity factor. So how quickly can someone do the work? What is the output per unit of labor time? That's basically what a production rate is. So it's the amount of work that can be completed by a worker or a group of workers in a set period of time. When we're looking at productivity factors, intuitively, they're very, very easy to understand. But the one thing that people mess up when they're not paying attention is they interpret the rate incorrectly. This can cause massive problems with estimates. So there's a couple of different ways you see productivity factors expressed. You have to be really, really careful of how the production rate's been expressed. We've got a task per hour. So we could say the amount of formwork someone would install in an hour. So they might do 1 meter squared of formwork in 1 hour or 2 meters squared of formwork in 1 hour. Then we've also got tasks per shift. So sometimes you might express a volume of work that would be done across a day. That we always have to be careful with, because when people express a shift rate, they're factoring in non-productive time. So they might say a crew can do 2,000 meters per day. That doesn't mean 10 productive hours per day. If you have 1.5 hours a day of non-productive time, that means they'll do 2,000 meters in 8.5 productive hours. So when we're talking about shift rates, you just have to be really careful that when people are expressing shift rates, they're already including non-productive time. The other way we hear production rates is units per time. So this might be the amount of concrete that can be poured in a shift. So for example, if you're pouring concrete from a concrete pump, you might be able to pour 120 meters cubed a shift. Depending on the structure, you might have 6 workers allocated to that task or 4 workers allocated to that task. But the production rate is going to be based on how quickly they can place concrete, which will be concrete poured per unit of time. So that's the other way you hear production rates expressed. And the final one that you have to be really, really careful about is some people talk about production rates as the amount of time to do a unit of work. So that's different to the amount of, I just want to make sure I'm expressing this correctly, that's different to the amount of work per unit of time. So as in, you could do 2 meters squared per man hour is the same as saying it's 0.5 man hours per meter squared. See the difference? You have to be careful whether someone's expressing your production rate as the amount of work per hour or the amount of hours per unit of work. That's probably the easiest one to mess up and the one you have to be most careful of when people express it as task per hour or hours per task. So how do you come up with productivity rates? Well, there's lots of different ways you can do it. And I'm guessing if you're a construction manager or business owner, you probably already have a good feel for some of these different production rates. If you do a lot of trenching work, you've probably got a really good feel for how much trenching you can do in a shift. If you work for a concreting company, you've probably got a really good feel for formwork production rates for different types of structures. So I'm just going to briefly go through the different categories of ways we could come up with these production rates. The first one, which I think is the best one and every construction business should set up, is some form of cost tracking. This is basically looking at your historical data. You can look at old projects and you can say, how many man hours did we take to do this volume of work? And then you can actually get objective production metrics. The other way, as I've said, is you could just engage with experienced people. You could engage with people who've done this sort of work. For example, working on a solar farm, you might be able to work with someone who's an electrician. They might be able to tell you, depending on a certain sort of tracker, how many panels you could plug in per shift, how many panels you can plug in per hour. So you can build up production rates by dealing with experienced people. There's also a series of industry standards and manuals. You can Google them, look them up online, and there's some really good guidebooks that have actually gone to the effort of compiling all these labor rates into a single source. There's software tools and databases. For example, Procore has production rates in it that you can find. And then in some instances, if you're using some sort of proprietary product, manufacturers might actually give you installation times. Again, referring to solar farms, because I've worked on a lot of them, manufacturers will often give you estimated man hours for different tasks that they'll have got from their own research and information. So there's a variety of sources you can look at to come up with production rates. My recommendation would be to use multiple sources. It's going to minimize the chance of errors. The final thing you have to do is you have to always consider these production rates and adjust them for site factors. So for example, the easiest one, trenching. If we're trenching in good ground conditions, the production rate we have is going to be very different to if we're trenching through rock. Same with piling, same with earthworks. But there's other sort of adjustments we might have to make. For example, if we're working on a project that's really, really spaced out, we might have to do 20 minutes of actual travel from where the lunchrooms are to where the site is. So you could easily be losing 20 minutes every single break you take with people going back to the lunchrooms and coming back out. So these are all the sorts of things we have to factor our production rates by to make sure they're as accurate as possible. Next, I just want to quickly touch on that while you could get a production rate for an individual, more commonly, you're probably going to see production rates for a crew. So for example, you might have a civil crew doing trenching. That crew might consist of a supervisor, an operator, and a laborer. The production rate you're going to get is going to be for the crew of individuals. So how much work can a crew do per hour? How much work can a crew do per shift? And you're going to see this across all trades. Electricians might work in teams of 2, terminating cables. Really just depends on the nature of the activity. So when you hear the term a gang rate is basically an hourly rate that's built up for a team of individuals. Then all the man hours are then allocated to the team rather than just looking at the production rate as an individual. Just working through a really, really simple example to show you what I'm talking about. So if we say we want to work out the man hours for 2,000 meters of trenching and backfill, we've got a production rate of 30 meters per shift, and there's 9 productive hours per shift. So we're going to need a civil crew to do this task, consists of a supervisor, a labourer and operator. And based on this production rate of 30 metres per shift, we're going to need 67 shifts to do the 2,000 metres of trenching. Based on these 9 productive hours per shift, if we go 67 by 9, we get 603 hours for each of the individuals. So we'd have to sum these 3 together to get the total man hours for the task. Then, using the built-up cost rates, we apply the number of man hours to the rate we've calculated using that calculator I showed you before. So if we say supervisor, the built-up cost rate is $95 an hour and the labour is $85 an hour, we can times total man hours by the hourly rate to get the labour costs. And it's really as simple as that. It's just basic maths. We just have to be mindful that we're allowing for everything when we do these calculations. That's the hardest thing about it, making sure we've correctly built up the labour cost rate and that we're using accurate production rates and have done accurate quantity takeoffs. The maths is super, super simple. It's really just about following the process, dotting the I's and crossing the T's to make sure we're making these calculations correctly. In addition to allowing for the man hours across the direct costs, we should also allow for some labour overheads. I'm going to just touch on briefly because it's going to vary a lot from job to job, how you make these allowances, but these are just things like mobilisation or demobilisation. Do we have to allow for inductions? Do we have to allow for some time to people to get set up on the systems? The other one is risk. Do we want to allow 5% contingency across the board for inclement weather or any other sort of schedule risks? Basically these sorts of things. And as well, if it's a big project, you might want to allow for some hiring costs, so costs for advertising jobs, onboarding people, doing job interviews, these sorts of costs. But a lot of businesses generally allow for that in their corporate overheads. But yeah, it just depends on your approach. You just want to make sure it's covered somewhere. So I hope that explained the process of how to accurately calculate labour costs. It's not rocket science. It's pretty easy to do. It's just a methodical process you've got to go through to make sure that everything's covered. And I hope you enjoyed the video. As I said at the start, we've got a whole lot of free courses and training materials that I'll put a link to in the description. And I'll also put a link to the spreadsheet we were using to build up our labour rates. So thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed and I hope you got something out of it.